Yeah, so I'm gonna be the facilitator for the day for this call. I'm from Ghana and I'm a mentor for this program, the Online Youth Exchange. So, everyone online, I want to introduce our guest speaker. He's by the name James Elsmore. I hope, sorry if I didn't mention it well, from the United Kingdom. And he has a bachelor's in geography from University of North Carolina. He also has a master's in island studies from the University of the Highlands and Islands. So in 2017, he was named Forbes 30 under 30 for energy, and in 2018, named Solar 40 under 40 by Renewable Energy World Magazine. He is the director of the Solar Head of State, a non-profit that helps governments adopt renewable energy on their presidential policies, and also the founder of Island Innovations, a newsletter that spreads articles of renewable energy and sustainability in islands from Seychelles to Saint Lucia. So we had our last meeting 2 days ago of the Sustainable Economy Ministries Part 1. So um, today we are having the Part 2 with the main topic as the business care for sustainability. So thank you very much for joining the call, Mr. James. So um, the participants so far, anyone online? Shivani, are you there? Shivani?
James is here. I think Sarah's online and Shivani did send a message, but we can't hear you, Shivani.
Okay. I think we have to get more people online right now. Is that Shivani online?
Yes, this is Shivani from Fiji.
Great, awesome. So could you please introduce yourself to us?
Okay. Hi, Bula. My name is Shivani. I'm from Fiji. Currently, I'm a postgraduate student in climate change, and my partner and I, Jelly, we are working on the submission on MPAs and ocean protection. So that's my level of research right now. And yes, that's it. And I'm the university which I go to. It's a University of the South Pacific.
Great.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, Mr. James, could you please start with us for our agenda for the day? I hope we'll get a few more people joining the call later. Thank you.
Great. Well, I can. I'll just have to call on yourself, Rashid, and Shivani for all my questions. Actually, I'm really glad we have someone from Fiji here because my case study is in Fiji. So I'm going to be talking about something that I think my audience has more expertise on than me. But no, as we're only a couple of us, we can make it a little bit more interactive. So thanks for the introduction. My name obviously is James Elsmore. And I guess the first part of this talk, I'm going to be talking a bit more broadly about the business case for sustainability and a bit more conceptual ideas around that. Sorry, 1 second. Can you not shout, please? Can you not shout? Sorry, I'm at home and people are making noise. So I guess to start off with a few questions that I'll try and answer. And the first half of the call, what is sustainability? Why should sustainability be integral to business? What is green branding? And then the second half of the call, talking a bit more about islands. I work mostly in the Caribbean, a bit in the South Pacific and the Scottish Islands. looking at how island communities can improve their sustainability. So I'll just use a few case studies from that. I'll probably try and go through this a little bit quicker than I plan to because we're a small group, and then we can have a bit of a chat at the end. But feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions as we're going on as well. So you've probably seen this before, but a broad introduction in sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's the original definition from the Brundtland Report in 1987, and is a really helpful definition. There are different types of sustainability that you should consider. I think normally we tend to think of sustainability as environmental, which is obviously important. But in the business case particularly, it's important to think about the whole case for sustainability. So that's particularly includes long-term growth and economic sustainability and social sustainability, which is a little more fluffy and vague, around ideas of education, community development, and improving quality of life for people living and working around the company and being impacted by that. Customers are demanding greater sustainability and are willing to pay the price for sustainability. I thought this graph was really interesting, just showing some of the growing move by consumers to pay a price for sustainability. This is actually out of date now, 2014, but there is a growing trend now that consumers of products want to see a green brand, and they want to see that their product is sustainable. So big companies, big corporates are now moving to try and demonstrate their sustainability. And that's interesting because often sustainability is thought to not go with big business. How do we try and reconcile those two? And I guess this is a whole conversation that environmentalists need to have around whether we work within the existing system that is still a capitalist global system that is dominated by big business, and whether it's possible to achieve sustainability within that system is definitely up for debate, and I won't get into that too much. But also there's the idea that we need a completely system reform, and a lot of people would argue that it's not possible to achieve full sustainability from big businesses. In terms of consumers, what people think sustainable consumption is, I thought this was just an interesting graphic from Hong Kong consumers. People have different ideas of what sustainability is, and so this is perhaps slanted towards the Hong Kong point of view, and you might get different answers in America or Ghana, for example. People might have kind of different priorities, but I think overall worldwide we'd see similar topics coming up: waste recycling, the impact on climate change, and air quality. Perhaps in East Asia, air quality is a particularly big issue, so that might rate more highly here than in other areas. Endangered species, animals, and energy, of course, is a big one. And that's the area that I work in, is focused on renewable energy. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. I'm rushing through this. So I mentioned Fiji. I have a brief video here which talks about greenwashing. And obviously I'm going to ask Shivani for her perspective on this afterwards as our Fijian representative. I think the reason that I wanted to bring up greenwashing when we talk about the business case for sustainability is there's a difference between sustainable brands and sustainable business. Companies want their brand to be seen as being sustainable. That doesn't mean that they are sustainable. I work personally in my own consulting business. I work with companies that may approach me and say, we want to brand ourselves as green and we want to appear green to our consumers, but they're not actually willing to change their business model. And so that becomes spin and is not, I think the point is that often consumers can recognize this type of greenwashing. So let me know if you can hear this. If not, I'll just send you the link to watch after. Can you hear the video?
Walk into any grocery store and you're bound to see it.
Yeah, yes, we can.
Okay.
It seems to be almost everywhere these days. Our eggs are all natural and our shampoos are encased in green labels adorned with leaves and generic trees. In many respects, this push towards an eco-friendlier consumerism is a positive change. Organic produce and sustainably made clothing are needed if we are to reduce industrial and personal footprints. But unfortunately, hidden among these ethically and environmentally driven products lies an insidious form of advertising: greenwashing. From bath products to meat packaging, greenwashing occurs in almost every sector of the consumer market. But today, let's take a close look at how Fiji Water uses ad campaigns to construct a green image around its otherwise environmentally detrimental company. But first, why exactly is greenwashing bad? Quite simply, it plays into a consumer's desire to live a green life without necessarily creating a sustainable product. And on a deeper level, one of the greenest things to do is to buy fewer things. So no matter how great the product is, it's probably still kind of deceptive to market it as green. So greenwashing means using titles like all natural or eco-friendly, or simply using a green background in order to entice a customer into buying a product that is by no means environmentally friendly. In some cases, bigger companies that falsely label their products as eco-friendly, like eggs labeled farm fresh or all natural, can often outcompete smaller companies who are more environmentally grounded and actually employ ethical practices while creating their product. Fiji Water's recent marketing campaign encapsulates the essence of this greenwashing.
Fiji Water is a gift from nature to us, to repay our gift of leaving it completely alone. Bottled at the source, untouched by man, it's Earth's finest water.
While aesthetically pleasing and pleasant to watch, there are a number of aspects that work hard to shroud Fiji Water's large environmental footprint in a cloud of green. For one, the bright double exposures of nature flickering within the edges of the bottle immediately cue us to Fiji Water's connection to nature. Especially when contrasted with the dark cityscape background, the water bottle appears to be a perfect image of a world quote-unquote untouched by man. The visuals are then compounded with the narration of a young girl who anchors the ad with this proclamation.
Bottled at the source, untouched by man.
Clearly, this ad works hard to paint Fiji Water as a part of nature, rather than what it really is. Water bottled in plastics that take many years to degrade, shipped via intensive transportation from Fiji to destinations around the world. Both these practices wreak havoc on the environment, including the air and the water. And to bring Fiji's negative impact into sharp relief, 47% of people who live in Fiji don't have access to clean, safe drinking water, according to the World Health Organization. This commercial is just a small part of Fiji's larger campaign that attempts to reimagine the bottled water company as the essence of nature. Spreads like this reveal the larger work at play in Fiji's greenwashed marketing tactics. They are pursuing environmentally minded customers, treating their water bottles as a completely green product. Fiji tells us a one-sided story that appeals to their customers' moral conscience. You can't help but choose Fiji over other bottled waters because they frame purchasing a Fiji bottle as a way to reduce carbon emissions and save the Fijian rainforest, when in fact their product is inextricably tied to the systems of pollution that are causing carbon emissions and deforestation. Greenwashing comes in many forms. It's not often as clear-cut as with Fiji Water, so understanding how and why greenwashing works is essential to spotting it. A critical deconstruction of a cleaning product is necessary if you're buying it solely because it's green. Oftentimes, nature...
Okay, I'll leave that presentation there. That wasn't meant to pick on Fiji particularly, but I thought this was a good example of some ideas. I think we had someone else just join the call. Would you like to introduce yourself? No? Okay, well, there's someone who's just joined. It's making a lot of noise. If you could mute your microphone, or if the host could do that for me. Okay, I think that's done. Thank you. Um, So now I've kind of given that overall introduction into sustainability and greenwashing. I want to talk a little bit about islands and the impact for island communities. And obviously, the Fiji video is a nice segue into that. A couple of examples of different islands who have actually used green branding to market themselves. Aruba in the Caribbean is a very famous tourist destination, and they also have a goal to reach 100% renewable energy. You can see this is their tourist logo where they've including this, and I think the island communities make a really interesting case study for the use of renewable energy. They often have very high costs of electricity and are very vulnerable to climate change. And so renewable energy projects in those communities are often quite impactful. Equally, the Scilly Isles in the UK have a big project to do renewable energy, and Samsø in Denmark. There's various island communities around the world that have really embraced the use of renewable energy and built that into their model to attract tourists. So in that case, you could say it's there's a business case for sustainability is not only the protection of their local environment, but also by adopting renewable energy, it's a useful part of their brand to attract tourists. Small island developing states, hopefully some of you have come across that term before. They're a group of around 58, it depends exactly how you count it, countries that are also particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and are looking to often use renewable energy as a way to both reduce their carbon emissions, but more importantly, adapt to the impacts of climate change. This is a real segue away from the other conversation, but this is the area that I'm more of an expert in. So kind of part 2 of the presentation. SIDS have a really high dependence on fossil fuels. Their generation costs run double or triple the cost of a similar community in the United States. And many of them are particularly vulnerable to oil shocks. But a lot of SIDS communities have high ambitions for using renewables. Several communities in the Pacific and the Caribbean have targets of 100%. Fiji here has 90%. That might have changed. This was for 2015, so I'm not sure how far they reached that. Fiji's a bit different because they do have water and the potential for hydro, which is not possible in other communities. But renewable energy is a really useful way for islands and other communities of reducing the impact of disasters and preparing for disasters. In Puerto Rico 2 years ago, the grid was wiped out completely. This is part of the United States where many people did not have power for over 1 year because a hurricane came through and wiped out the grid entirely. And are looking and when an island like this depended on oil and fossil fuels to generate its electricity, it could have instead, and as they're doing now in their recovery, used solar energy, which is less vulnerable to the impacts of hurricanes. I'm going to skip some of these because I'd rather just go on to a bit of a discussion. I'll skip some of these. So I say this because I think there's a really interesting case in terms of renewable energy for small island developing states to demonstrate real leadership on renewable energy. Renewable energy is beneficial for the local economy in terms of reducing costs, but also is a way for countries with these high goals to lead by example, demonstrate good solutions for climate change. Where did this come from? I think someone just drew on the screen. I'm not quite sure how they did that, but there's a purple line that's just appeared there from the host to demonstrate good leadership. And we saw that last year or the year before last at COP, with Fiji hosting the climate change COP, that small countries that are small in population can have a really big impact by their actions and by calling for change, despite being the most vulnerable communities to climate change. Just briefly to mention the work of the NGO that I operate in. Solar Head of State works internationally. It's a small group that encourages governments to adopt solar on prominent government buildings, whether that's the Parliament building, the presidential residence, the Prime Minister's offices, whatever makes sense locally. The NGO has worked in St. Lucia, Jamaica, and the Maldives, all small island developing states. And we now have a project with the Pacific Island Development Forum, PIDF, which will be to work in 10 different Pacific Island states over the next 2 years. The idea behind these projects is that by installing solar panels on these prominent buildings, it's a small step, but it's really important that buildings that are central politically and have this political importance can adopt renewable energy. And we are also very conscious that we don't want to be complicit in greenwashing that I mentioned before. So we only work with countries that are already have ambitious goals and have made good steps to implement renewables already. So I guess I'll leave it there. I kind of rushed through that because we're a small group, but hopefully there were some interesting little bits there. I'd rather talk some more with some questions a little bit and see if you have any thoughts or inputs on that. Also just wanted to encourage you to go to this website here, which is for the newsletter that I run called Island Innovation. And every 2 weeks, I send out stories from island communities that are implementing renewable energy projects from around the world, the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, African islands, and also Scotland and Europe as well. So please check that out on that link. I would really appreciate it. So I guess I'm going to point to you first, Shivani, because you're from Fiji. I'm going to ask if you have any questions or kind of any comments on particularly the discussion around Fiji water and the sustainability movement in Fiji.
Yeah.
Or,
Right there, Shivani.
Or anyone else can join in, whoever else is here.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. James Delsmore. It was a very nice and educated presentation. Can measure how sustainable how they can actually measure sustainability effort within their business activities. And also, you made mention about a point where you said consumers are willing to go for sustainability. Yeah, that is very true. But how expensive is sustainability itself? Because it's something that goes in the long run. So how expensive is it, especially for those in the global south and the developing countries? Thank you.
Definitely, I'll do my best. They're both very, very good questions. Could you repeat the first question? I didn't quite catch it. The second question was the costs associated. And sorry, what the first one was?
Yeah, so the first one was how a company could measure their sustainability efforts. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start with that one. The measuring of sustainability can be very subjective, and that's what leads to greenwashing. As a consumer, it's very difficult for you to know when you go to a shop, and let's take a product like toothpaste. You see 10 different brands of toothpaste on a shelf. You don't really know which of those companies are good at sustainability and which are just pretending and which aren't. You know, sometimes the one that is packaged in green and is trying to brand itself as sustainable may actually be less sustainable than the cheap brand that isn't trying. So that can be a real challenge. I mean, sometimes there are more obvious things such as packaging and how much packaging companies use. But there are so many different metrics, and there's one of the big issues with for consumers is that element of knowing. How do you know? You may have a company also that is really progressive in terms of its packaging, for example, but then gets the product from an unsustainable source or has other problems, because for every product you have a whole chain of different solutions with different points along it. For example, the transportation, if it's an agricultural product, growing it. So you have to think about sustainability along that entire production chain for each product. There are eco labels, I think, is one of the best movements. Off the top of my head, I actually can't think of an example, but well, perhaps for fisheries. Not every country has this, but often sustainable fisheries will have a special certification. So when a consumer buys a tin of fish at the supermarket, they will see on the side of that tin a stamp from the Blue Oceans Committee or something with a name like that certifies that this company is a member of that. But again, it's a problem for consumers because there then become so many of these eco labels. They don't know which ones are the most effective and which ones they should trust. So I say all that. That sounds quite difficult, definitely. But I say that because we, as consumers, should try and make educated decisions. But it's challenging to do that all the time. And so. I believe that as well as consumers being able to choose, it's important for governments to play a role in regulating sustainable business and to ensure that companies that say they are operating sustainably are actually doing so. There's definitely a role for government. In terms of the cost of sustainability, that's definitely an issue, and often that cost gets passed on to the person at the end buying it. And you mentioned in global south countries where that could obviously be prohibitive for people, but I think that applies worldwide as well. An increase by 10% in the price of a product is being passed on to the consumer and can make it unaffordable. And that's why often we see sustainability and eco and organic as something that really only the wealthy have access to. But I guess the other way of thinking about that is that those costs exist. So, for example, if you are making a product cheaper, but let's say you have two products, two bottles of water, different brands. But I mean, bottles of water are never particularly sustainable. I try and avoid plastic bottled water. One of those bottles is polluting the environment, and the company is causing a lot of damage to a village downstream from it by polluting the water. The other one is, to the best of its ability, operating sustainably, working with the community, etc. The one that's operating sustainably might cost more to the consumer at the end, but the cost of that are not being passed on. If the consumer is paying for the cheaper bottle of water, there are other costs, which are called externalities, which maybe then impact the local community and have adverse effects on the people living around that factory. So it's a difficult one because I think most consumers are always going to choose the cheapest product. But at the same time, if something is cheap, then the reason might be because the damaging effects of it being so cheap are passed on to other people. And again, I think that's where it's important, I believe, for the government to step in to ensure there is strong regulation. Was that clear?
Yeah, it's very clear to me. Yeah, but I was a bit concerned. I'm actually a bit concerned about companies that are into fossil fuel production and all that. how could Ghana, for instance, there are a lot of companies. So I'm actually thinking how they could be sustainable. So if there are any points that you can give, yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
I actually, the video that I was looking for before I found the Fiji water video was there's a company, BP, British Petroleum, who have now tried to rebrand themselves as Beyond Petroleum. And they have this beautiful video where they have wind turbines and solar panels and a green environment. But it's an oil company. And the oil company produces maybe 2% of its energy from renewables and 98% from oil, but they use the 2% of energy to the 2% of renewable energy to try and make the excuse that they're a green brand. So I think often these fossil fuel companies are great examples of greenwashing. It's not really possible to be a fossil fuel company and a sustainable brand. And I think in terms of I don't know much specifically about Ghana. I know a bit more about East Africa, like countries like Kenya and Tanzania, but there are a lot of opportunities now coming from renewable energy. And actually, as I said, for the SIDS countries, for many communities in East Africa, it's now cheaper to use renewable energy than to use traditional sources. So that's why I think this business case is really important for the transition, because as we move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, the main driver of that movement is going to be the price of the price. Even if a large group of people make that decision to move because they feel like they're willing to pay more and they're willing to spend that extra money, for most people, the thing that's going to make them move is cheaper. And if it's cheaper to use a solar panel than it is to burn coal, then people are going to use a solar panel. And that has the additional benefits of not polluting their neighborhood, not impacting their health. And so we're seeing that with renewable energy. And I think we're going to see that more for other areas. For example, plastic waste. If governments tax plastic bottles, we will then see companies look for alternatives than wasteful plastic bottles. But I think some of it is happening naturally through the free market in terms of the renewable energy as fossil fuels get used up and renewables becomes cheaper. Some of it will also need some help from the government to ensure that the negative costs that are passed on are actually borne by the companies or the people using those products instead.
Great. You really answered my question. Thank you so much. So to all other participants, if anyone has a question, please unmute and then let us know. If there are no questions, I think those who joined late, you could probably introduce yourselves to Mr. James. Thanks.
Hello, good morning, Mr. James.
Good morning.
Yeah, this is Samson speaking from Nigeria.
Hi, Samson.
I'm fine. Yeah, I joined the meeting quite late because I had to attend to some other things. But right now, I was able to meet up with the discussions about regulation and sustainability. And I heard you discussing about companies producing fossil fuel, how they cannot actually be prove to be sustainable on the other hand. But then you made a point, you made the fact that, okay, fine, if the rate of using solar panel or other useful means is reduced, whereby people, even the poor people, can be able to afford them, that maybe they will quite quit using fossil fuel for using other sustainable ways of energy. But I want to quickly shape this in, what do we do about the attitudinal problem that people have? Even at that, even at bringing down the solar panel cost or any other useful sustainable energy source down to the fact that people will be able to be ignorant. So what do we do about this kind of issue?
Great question. Thanks, Samson. And I think, being realistic for the majority of the world's population who are living on a very low income, they're going to take the decisions that are most financially viable. If you're living on a few dollars a day, you're going to do whatever saves you the most money. So I guess my first point before I come on to the question about education is there's a really interesting company called M-Kopa, M-K-O-P-A. And there are other similar companies doing similar things, but this is one I know well, which operates in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And they are trying to get past the issue of the upfront investment costs, because buying a solar panel might be cheaper in the long run, but maybe you haven't got all that money to invest one day in buying it. So you normally buy maybe paraffin for lights or something similar every week. You may pay someone to charge your phone instead. And so M-Kopa, check it out, really good company. But to summarize, they have a very small battery and solar system, which it's designed for people who currently have no access to electricity. It costs around $100, so it's not cheap for a lot of people. But they've created a system because mobile pay is very common in Kenya, where the SIM card is inside the battery, and you can actually pay in weekly installments to pay off the cost for the same price as perhaps you would have been paying before for paraffin and costs like that. So I won't go into any more detail, but definitely check them out as a really exciting example. And what I like about them is they're not a charity. They're a for-profit business that is making money for themselves, but also is benefiting hundreds of thousands of people in the region. And because they're a for-profit company, they invest a lot of money in advertising, which comes on to your second point. So they actually need to go and persuade people about the benefits of their product. And understandably, people are slow to adopt new things because they don't want to take the risk. And this applies worldwide. If something is going to cost you money or it's a new product, you're not familiar with it, you are going to not necessarily take a risk on that. So the education is really important. I think there is a role for different parties here. The private sector who is promoting these products, they need to be good at advertising. Universities have a role, and I think universities are really key. If you have the institutions that are educating the future leaders of a country, they should be leading by example. And you do see that in some countries. So universities that are going above and beyond to become green examples. But again, that takes money, and universities often don't have money, so they need to find ways of doing that successfully. An interesting thing with solar panels, and for most new technology actually this applies to, is that people tend to, you get maybe a few people, 1% of people who are the early adopters. They're the adventurous people that take on the new product. And the majority of people wait until their next door neighbor has used it before they use it themselves. And there was a study done in the United States that said the biggest indicator of whether someone installed solar panels on their house was not political ideology, was not income, was not geography. It was simply whether someone on their street did it first. And if someone on your street installs solar, you become 3 times more likely to install it yourself. So I think it's an unfortunate reality. It takes time for people to adopt new technologies. It takes time for change. And there's no easy answer. I wish I had a better answer, but hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of the difficulty of it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, hello everyone. How are you? So, I have joined in very late, such that I could not follow up from what was being said. But what I have kept was that the sustainability of our own environment depends upon ourselves.
Great question, great feedback.
Hello, sir.
Hello. Sorry. Can you repeat that? I can't hear you very well.
No, I was just saying
anyone-
that. Oh no.
Sorry. I'm not sure who is speaking, but if you want to try again, and go ahead. I think you're muted now. There were two different people speaking. I'm not sure who they were.
Hear you.
Or you can also type the question if you aren't able to speak for some reason. No, I think they've gone. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, well, shall we leave it there then? You all have my email address here. You have the link to the newsletter. Please feel free to contact me if you need any more information. I'm happy to share links to anything we discussed today. And thank you for those of you that joined. Really appreciate it. We can follow up by. Sorry, I'm just reading these messages. Okay, I think we're fine. Yeah, hopefully some other people will get to watch this online. Thank you very much for listening.